My husband stood up in that courtroom, pointed his finger directly at me, and said the word that would have ended everything I'd built. Cheater. Then he turned and pointed at a man sitting 2 rows behind me, someone I barely knew beyond polite nods at neighborhood association meetings. That's her secret lover, Your Honor. I have proof. I felt the entire courtroom's attention shift toward me like a physical weight, dozens of eyes recalculating everything they thought they knew about the woman sitting at the petitioner's table. My business partner shifted uncomfortably beside me. My attorney's hand tightened briefly on my arm, a silent warning to stay composed. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Halloway who'd shown little patience for theatrics throughout this trial, studied me with an expression that made my stomach drop. Not outright hostile, but skeptical in a way that suggested she was already recalculating her assumptions about the entire case. I was 3 motions away from losing my company, my house, and now, apparently, my reputation as an honest woman, based on an accusation I hadn't even seen coming. Then the man my husband had just accused me of sleeping with rose slowly to his feet, reached into his jacket pocket, and pulled out his phone. Nobody in that courtroom, including me, had any idea what he was about to play. My name is Vanessa Okafor, and 18 months earlier, my husband Desmond and I had built what looked, from the outside, like an enviable life. A boutique architecture firm I'd founded and grown to 12 employees. A renovated brownstone in a neighborhood people waited years to move into. 2 teenage kids who mostly stayed out of our increasingly cold marriage. What nobody outside our house knew was that Desmond had spent the last 3 years growing resentful of my company's success, the way it had steadily outpaced his own consulting practice, the way clients had started referring to him, half-jokingly, as Vanessa Okafor's husband at industry events. I hadn't caused that shift intentionally. I'd simply built something that worked, while his consulting business had stagnated through a combination of bad luck and, if I'm honest, decisions I'd quietly disagreed with for years. The man Desmond had just accused me of having an affair with was named Julian Reyes, a structural engineer I'd worked with on exactly 1 project 8 months earlier, a mixed-use development downtown that required his firm's expertise for a complicated load-bearing redesign. We'd exchanged perhaps 30 professional emails and attended 4 site meetings together. That was the entire extent of our relationship. I hadn't understood, until this trial began unfolding, that Desmond's legal strategy hinged almost entirely on painting me as unfaithful, hoping that framing would tilt the judge's perception of asset division in his favor, especially regarding my company, which Desmond's attorneys were arguing should be considered joint marital property despite my sole founding and ownership. I'd been blindsided by the affair accusation specifically because I genuinely had no idea where it was coming from. No idea what evidence Desmond's attorney claimed to have, until Julian, sitting quietly in that courtroom as a character witness for an entirely different matter, suddenly found himself dragged into the center of it. What none of us understood yet was exactly what was on that phone Julian was now holding, and why he seemed almost calm, rather than panicked, about being accused of something so serious in open court. 3 months before this trial, Desmond had hired a private investigator named Roland Briggs, a fact I only learned during discovery, buried in an expense report his attorney had accidentally included in a document dump. Roland had apparently followed me for 6 weeks, photographing every meeting, every dinner, every late night at the office, searching for exactly the kind of ammunition Desmond needed to strengthen his position in our divorce. According to Desmond's court filing, Roland had photographed Julian and me at a restaurant 8 months earlier, sharing what looked, from a distance and the right angle, like an intimate dinner. In reality, that dinner had been a working session with 2 other colleagues from Julian's firm. Colleagues who'd stepped away briefly to take phone calls at the exact moment Roland's camera captured the photo, leaving what looked, out of context, like Julian and I dining alone. I hadn't even remembered that specific dinner until Desmond's attorney presented the photograph during the trial, time-stamped and grainy. Exactly the kind of evidence that looks damning until you understand the full context surrounding it. What I didn't know, sitting there trying to process the accusation in real time, was that Julian had actually noticed Roland following us weeks before that photograph was taken. Julian, cautious by nature after a messy divorce of his own years earlier, had quietly started recording certain business meetings for his own protection, a habit born from previous professional disputes rather than any anticipation of being dragged into someone else's divorce trial. He hadn't told me about any of this beforehand, not because he was hiding something, but because until this exact moment, in this exact courtroom, he'd had no idea Desmond intended to weaponize that dinner into an affair accusation serious enough to threaten my custody arrangements and business ownership. Julian pressed play on his phone, and the courtroom's overhead speakers, connected through the same system used for evidence presentation, crackled to life with audio neither Desmond nor his attorney had anticipated existing at all. The audio began mid-conversation, Julian's voice calm and professional. So the load calculations for the North Wing need revision before we submit to the city. Then my voice, equally businesslike, discussing beam specifications and permit timelines. The recording continued for nearly 2 full minutes, an entirely mundane conversation about structural engineering, punctuated occasionally by our 2 colleagues' voices as they returned to the table between phone calls. Judge Holloway's expression shifted from cautious skepticism to something sharper, more focused, as she listened to 2 minutes of conversation that contained absolutely nothing resembling an affair, nothing intimate, nothing beyond the exact kind of professional collaboration I described from the start. "Mr. Reyes," Judge Holloway said, once the recording ended, "why do you have an audio recording of this specific dinner?" Julian answered calmly, still standing. "Your Honor, after a difficult divorce of my own, I started recording certain client meetings for documentation purposes, particularly ones involving multiple stakeholders where miscommunication could create liability issues later. This wasn't unusual for me. I simply happened to record this particular dinner because we were finalizing critical structural decisions that evening." Desmond's face had gone through several rapid transformations, confidence collapsing into something closer to panic as his attorney frantically whispered something in his ear. "Your Honor," my attorney said, seizing the moment, "I'd like to formally submit this recording as evidence, along with a request that the court examine exactly how and why Mr. Okafor's legal team presented a photograph without context as evidence of infidelity, when actual audio evidence directly contradicts that characterization." Judge Holloway nodded slowly, her earlier skepticism toward me now fully redirected toward Desmond's legal strategy. "I'll allow it. And Mr. Whitfield," she said, addressing Desmond's attorney directly, "I trust you'll want to reconsider several other claims in your client's filing, given what we've just heard." Desmond sat frozen at the defense table, the accusation he'd just leveled with such confidence now completely unraveling in front of everyone. The recess that followed lasted nearly an hour, during which Desmond's attorney requested an emergency conference with Judge Holloway to discuss what he called new developments requiring reassessment of our position. I sat outside the courtroom with my own attorney, Marguerite Chen, who'd represented me since this process began 8 months earlier. "This changes things significantly," she said, though her expression remained carefully measured, unwilling to celebrate prematurely. "The affair accusation was central to their entire strategy for challenging your sole ownership of the company. Without it, they're left arguing purely on financial contribution grounds, which we've already prepared extensively for." Julian found me in the hallway before court resumed, looking slightly uncomfortable with the attention he'd unexpectedly become the center of. "I'm sorry you had to go through that," he said. "I should have mentioned the recording existed before things got this far, but honestly, I didn't think Desmond would actually go through with a public accusation like that." "You don't need to apologize," I told him. "You just saved me from something that could have destroyed my custody arrangement, not just my company." When court resumed, Desmond's attorney requested to withdraw the infidelity claim entirely, citing insufficient supporting evidence, a careful legal phrase that avoided directly admitting they'd fabricated a narrative around an out-of-context photograph. Judge Holloway, however, wasn't willing to simply move past it that easily. "Before we proceed," she said, "I want it noted for the record that this court takes seriously the presentation of misleading evidence in family court proceedings. I'll be reviewing whether this warrants further action beyond simply withdrawing the claim." Desmond's face, already pale, seemed to lose what little color remained. His carefully constructed strategy, designed to paint me as an unfaithful wife undeserving of my own company's value, had just collapsed in front of the exact judge whose opinion mattered most. What remained now was the actual question the trial was supposed to answer from the beginning: how to fairly divide assets between 2 people whose marriage had genuinely, quietly ended long before either of us said the word divorce out loud. The remainder of the trial proceeded very differently than its opening had suggested. Without the affair accusation clouding the judge's perception, Desmond's legal team was left arguing purely on the financial merits. Whether my company, founded 3 years before our marriage but grown substantially during it, should be considered separate or marital property. Marguerite presented clear documentation showing the company's initial founding predated our marriage by 3 years, supported by original incorporation paperwork, early client contracts, and financial records establishing its independent value before Desmond and I had even met. While Desmond's attorney argued that my company's growth during our marriage entitled him to a share of that increased value, the court ultimately determined that his contribution to that growth had been minimal, unlike the direct, documented work I'd done building the business from its earliest days. The final judgment awarded Desmond a modest settlement reflecting general marital asset division. Our shared home eventually sold with proceeds split according to standard guidelines, but my company remained entirely mine, protected by documentation that made clear exactly how much of its success predated and existed independently of our marriage. Judge Holloway, in her closing remarks, addressed the courtroom directly. I want to note for the record that presenting misleading evidence in a family court proceeding is a serious matter. Mr. Okafor's legal team will be receiving correspondence from this court regarding appropriate next steps. I left that courtroom that afternoon with my company intact, my reputation restored in the eyes of the people who mattered, and a strange, quiet exhaustion that came from realizing how close I'd come to losing everything based on an accusation that had never actually been true. Desmond and I have maintained a careful, businesslike co-parenting relationship since then, built more on necessity than warmth. Julian and I remained professional colleagues, our working relationship slightly more cautious now, both of us aware of how easily context can be weaponized against people who've done nothing wrong. I think about that recess often, the hour where everything hung in uncertain balance, waiting to learn whether the truth would actually matter in that courtroom. So I'll ask you what I've asked myself since that day. If someone tried to destroy your reputation with evidence stripped of context, would you have trusted the truth to eventually surface? Or would you have felt, the way I did in that moment, like the outcome depended entirely on luck rather than justice?